Hello again. I want to talk about fear in this little video and how to manage fear. And the first thing that we need to understand about fear, or that's really useful to understand about fear, is that we could say there are two types of fear. There is real fear and unreal fear. Or another word for it is primary and secondary. Primary is real fear and secondary is unreal fear. Now that may seem a bit strange because fear is fear and it all feels real, and I totally acknowledge that. Whether we have primary or secondary fear, and I'm going to explain the difference in a minute, whichever we have, it's going to trigger the same response in the body. And this is really important to understand for when I go into the explanation of the difference between the two, because we need to understand why it is that we're having such a fearful, stressful response inside our body and inside our mind, even when the fear isn't real. So, primary, secondary fear. Primary fear is the reaction, the biological reaction that our body has in response to a real threat to our life. For example, you nearly crash your car, or you suddenly notice that your house is on fire and you have to run out, or you notice the neighbor's house is on fire, or you're just stepping off the curb and you nearly got run over by a bus, or you're sitting in a plane and it starts to plummet down towards the earth, or you're in a war zone and there are bombs going off all over the place. That is real fear. It's primary fear because it is a real, in the now threat to your life. And in response to that, the body will automatically go into the stress response, which changes the biological functioning of the body to be able to manage that threat as quickly and as best as possible. So that is primary fear. Secondary fear is when our body goes into the same response, but the threat isn't real, it's perceived. And usually that perceived threat is in the mind. It has very much to do with what we are thinking about in our mind. And whatever it is that we're thinking about in our mind, we think it's real, even though it may be just imagination. So examples of perceived fear, perceived threats, are when we have worrying going on, and worrying is mentally rehearsing what we don't want to happen. It's a form of negativity and pessimism. We can have what I call worst case scenario thinking, where we're imagining the worst case scenario. And whatever it is that is going on in our mind, we project it out into the world, but it's purely and only in our mind. But as a result of that thinking, we put the body into the stress response. We put it into the same stress response as if we were in a real danger. Now the really interesting thing is, when we're in a real danger, we will just actually immediately go into constructive action, hopefully if we don't freeze, but we will go into taking some action to sort the problem out. In other words, we'll step back off the curb to avoid the bus running us over, or we will run out of the house to get away from the fire. We will take some action to manage the situation in order to reduce the fear. But when we're in a situation where we're in secondary fear, this doesn't happen. Excuse me, I'm going up a steep hill, puffing a bit. So we won't take the action when it's secondary fear. We'll just go on and on and on, thinking about this potential outcome, which probably will never happen, going on over and over and over in our mind about it, worrying, worst case scenario thinking. And that will just keep the fear going. It will just keep the body stuck in the stress response. So what is the solution? Just going to have a bit of a rest here. What is the solution? Well, the first thing is we have to start asking ourselves, anytime we go into fear, we have to ask ourselves, is this real or unreal fear? Or we could say to ourselves, is this primary or secondary fear? Because if it's primary fear, then we need to do something about it, and we probably will already be doing something about it. If it's secondary fear, then we need to become aware of what the pattern is, the thinking pattern behind the fear, because the fear is just being run by an old, unhealthy thinking pattern. So worry is a habit. As I said before, it's the mental habit of mentally rehearsing what we don't want to happen. And it's not an emotion. Worry is a habit. And we have to stop the worry habit if we want to stop worrying. We just have to stop the habit of doing it. So whenever we notice ourselves worrying or going into negative thinking and pessimism, we just say stop or cancel, and we replace it with a different, more positive thought. We just have to be onto it, be aware of ourselves, and stop our thinking. And only we can do that. Nobody else can do it for us. But the good news is we can do it for us, and with practice and repeating, we can change that thinking. So there's a lot more that I could talk about with fear. I'll just say one more thing in terms of helping to deal with fear. Is I always recommend EFT, Emotional Freedom Technique, which is also known as tapping. There are hundreds, thousands of videos on YouTube to teach you how to tap, but it's a great first aid kit for alleviating any type of emotion, and we're just talking about fear today. The other thing that's also really useful that I teach in the Emotional Alchemy Academy is the first thing that emotions want is to be acknowledged and recognized and validated. So if we can just take a few deep breaths, whether it's real fear or imaginary fear, and actually if it's real fear, we're just going to be dealing with the fear. We won't have time to do this, so this is only really mainly useful for imagined fear. If we can just take a few deep breaths, acknowledge the fact that we're feeling afraid and validate that feeling, and then do some sort of emotional clearing technique to reduce the fear levels. And then very importantly, start looking at the deeper roots of that pattern, because whenever we get triggered into fear through our thinking processes and through these patterns of thinking, it's usually because we have some deeper unconscious patterns at work, or maybe unresolved trauma from the past, something that needs to be looked at and healed and worked on and worked through. So we're not going to go into that here, that's not the place to do it, but just to point it out. So I hope this gives you some food for thought on dealing with fear.